so much. I'm so excited to be here. Vancouver is so beautiful. I got to see some of it with Margot yesterday, which was amazing. And yeah, so as Kevin said, my research focuses on the societal impacts of machine learning, and that's been a really motivating question for me throughout my PhD. And earlier on, a lot of my work was kind of in this world of how do we do constrained optimization to satisfy goals like fairness or interpretability in machine learning systems when you have these systems plugging into like social decision-making settings. But more recently, my interests have kind of shifted towards maybe from what can we optimize more towards what should we be optimizing in these very high-stakes societal settings. So this second question is really inherently an interdisciplinary one, and I found it really fulfilling and exciting to learn about economics and the social sciences and trying to understand this. So today I'm going to share some work in that vein, where I'm working on improving societal impacts of machine learning, bringing together ideas from causal inference, statistics, economics, and public policy. Right. Okay, so as probably many of us are familiar with CAIDA and everything, machine learning and data-driven systems are very deeply embedded in many high-stakes, socially important settings. And one common way in which this shows up is through online ranking platforms. And these kinds of rankings that are very widespread, and they affect everything from, say, university operations to what charities people donate to maybe like more domestic decisions, like what real estate agent somebody might use. Maybe to very also very high stakes life-altering decisions like what hospital someone might go to for an important operation like a C-section or a heart surgery. And our statistical and computational methods these days has really developed and evolved to a point where we can deploy these kinds of ranking systems at scale with kind of arbitrarily complex metrics and high-dimensional data. But a prevailing challenge here with the societal impacts of these systems is that the metrics that we optimize don't always match broader societal goals. And this is a phenomenon that's not new to this era of big data and machine learning. It's been well known across the social sciences. Economists have called this Goodhart's law, where any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. And Goodhart wrote this in the context of monetary policy and finance. Somewhat concurrently, Donald Campbell said something pretty similar in the context of evaluating social programs and political processes. And a sort of shortened adage, which has now kind of been popularized, comes from Marilyn Strathern, who's an anthropologist, who said, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And she wrote this in the context of education and business and management practices. So this mismatch between metrics and goals is not new to machine learning, but one thing that is true these days is that, well, behind every machine learning algorithm is a metric. And so as our computational and optimization power has grown, the consequences on society of these mismatches has also grown. So today, I'm going to be talking about a specific manifestation of this problem, this mismatch between metrics and goals that impacts healthcare in particular, but also as a general pattern affects all of these kinds of ranking systems that we as machine learning folks have worked a lot on. So to set that scene, I'm going to tell a story. So in the early 90s, accountability metrics kind of grew in popularity in the US. And as sort of a pioneer in these efforts, the New York Health Department mandated that all hospitals report quality metrics like mortality rates for different procedures. And the idea behind this was that this is supposed to lead to, say, better transparency, better patient outcomes, better hospital accountability. But unfortunately, it didn't actually quite work out that way. And economist Stranow et al. Showed that actually publishing these mortality rates led to actually worse outcomes for more severely ill patients. And one mechanism that they pointed to for why this could have happened is through selection behavior on part of the hospitals, where hospitals and doctors have exercised some selection power over whom they choose to treat. And the incentives that were induced by something like a mortality rate metric are to lean towards treating healthier patients rather than sicker guys. Today, with all of our excitement and focus on these data-driven systems, the use of these and the use and kind of proliferation of these types of metrics has really grown, not just in health, but like in all different kinds of data-driven systems. In health in particular, the US government has invested over $1 billion in the last 10 years developing these kinds of quality metrics. And these days, they're mostly collected by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which publishes like, a long list of, over 100 of these. And they get used in different ways. So I'm focusing on the health example for now. CMS will use these metrics to actually directly determine payment to hospitals. So if a hospital does particularly well in the quality metric, they'll receive some bonus payment in their insurance payouts. And if they do poorly, they'll receive some kind of penalty, and that's what's called the merit-based incentive payment system. But in addition to these kinds of direct payment systems, which are very well studied in economics, we also have these metrics feeding into these ranking systems, which are very well studied in machine learning. And the US News and World Report, for instance, publishes this entire ranking, but there's also more local ranking systems per procedure that are also pretty widely used. And also this problem isn't just limited to the health setting. We see this in many different kinds of settings. So this kind of selection behavior, for instance, shows up in the education setting where universities exercise some selection power over what students they admit. And this then affects whatever metrics are computed about them, like student success rates regarding graduation or maybe employment. And this then feeds into ranking systems, again, like the US News and World Report, and also accrediting agencies in the US. As kind of a more commercial example, we can imagine a situation where some service provider, like a real estate agent, has selection power over whom they choose to work with, like which buyers and sellers they choose to work with, and then this leads to whatever metrics computed about them, like sales volume, which then again feed into these ranking systems, which these days are, very popular or technically built with like platforms like Zillow or Yelp and Google. Okay, so I've set up this situation now where we're thinking about measuring the performance of some service provider that has selection power over whom they choose to treat or work with. And in this world, I'm gonna ask 3 key questions today. The first is a question of incentives, which is how do we design quality metrics that are going to lead to better treatment incentives? And as a preview of what I'll show here, my background being from machine learning, I'm going to show how we can incorporate a counterfactual estimate, which is learned, which is essentially going to be a modular piece that we as machine learning folks can contribute to in order to make this quality metric stuff better. The second question I'm going to talk about is this question of ranking systems. What happens when these quality metrics feed into these large online ranking platforms? And specifically, do rankings based on these quality metrics continue to behave reasonably? And this shows up in the health setting because you have all of these CMS metrics that are ingested by various online ranking platforms. So as a preview of what I'll show there, the short answer is not necessarily. You can't just take quality metric by itself and plug it directly into a ranking system. But what I will show is actually how we can modify these metrics to still have the good incentive properties that economists will care about, but also plug into these ranking systems. And finally, one complication, which is going to complicate all of this, is the problem of information asymmetry. And the specific type of information asymmetry I'm going to talk about today is what if the hospitals actually know more about patients than the regulatory agencies? And this is a very, I see a lot of people nodding, so yes, this will definitely show up. And as a preview of what I'll show here, it actually turns out that information asymmetry is makes this problem fundamentally difficult. And even a perfect counterfactual estimate that I'm going to show in this first part is still going to have suboptimal welfare in this world of information asymmetry. But what I will give is some upper and lower bounds on regret, and then we can talk more also about future work that can be done in that setting. Okay, so actually maybe I should take any questions so far about. Okay, I'm happy to answer questions too throughout if you have anything that is unclear.
Yeah,
oh, sure. Yeah.
Silly question, but don't you need metrics to evaluate your metrics?
Great question. Yes, that's an excellent question. And I don't, honestly, I don't have a full solution to that. That's one broad issue that I've been thinking a lot about. In this work, yes, we will have a metric to evaluate our metrics. It's going to be grounded in prior work in econ. Yeah, but yeah, great observation. So now let me situate our work in a broader context. And so our work today, we're going to be focusing on the effects of quality measurement on treatment incentives. And this relates to this broader phenomenon known as cream skimming, which has been studied by economists and social scientists in the context of insurance and social, like evaluation of social welfare programs. And today, we're specifically looking at this kind of treatment selection behavior that relates also closely to the technical developments in policy learning, which comes from econometrics and machine learning, where policy learning studies what this question of what would an individual hospital do in optimizing their treatment policy, given whatever observational data about patients that they have. So this is like, how would an individual hospital learn their best treatment policy? But policy learning alone doesn't build in any incentives or agency structure. So a third component that I'm going to bring in today is principal agent theory from economics as well. And with principal agent theory, what we're going to get basically is a setup where we have a principal who only has indirect control over the policy, over the treatment policy that gets carried out via some reward function or some quality metric here that they're going to be able to set. Okay, so in this context now, like given those pieces, I'm going to give two main theoretical building blocks to getting to our results. And the first comes from causal inference, and it's potential outcomes notation. So in this notation, we're going to have some, for each patient I, we're going to have some covariates or features or characteristics, depending on what you want to call it. I'll call them covariates here. And these, you can think of these as, say, the patient's prior medical history, their demographic information, etc. We're also going to have a binary treatment assignment variable T, where 0 means that the patient was not treated, 1 means that they're treated. And I'm going to let y of 0 and y of 1 denote the potential outcomes if the patient was untreated or treated. So y of 0 would be what would happen if the patient was not treated, y of 1 would be a random variable for what would happen if the patient was treated. But the fundamental problem of causal inference is that we cannot observe both of these simultaneously. So what we're going to instead have is an observed outcome, this random variable y, which is this y of the random variable t. And two quantities that I'm going to bring in here, which also come from causal inference, are we're going to care about the conditional average potential outcomes. So mu1 of x represents the average treated potential outcome conditioned on a patient having characteristics x. Mu0 of x is going to be the average untreated potential outcome conditioned on the patient having characteristics x. And I'm going to let tau of x denote the conditional average treatment effect. So this is the difference between the treated and the untreated potential outcome conditioned on a patient having characteristics x. So all of this is kind of setting up to give a notation and understand what outcomes would be based on treatment. And the second technical building block that I'm going to give a little bit of background on now is the principal agent model from economics, which economists in the room will already be super familiar with this. But just as some background for folks that haven't seen this before, in a principal agent model, we're going to have some principal, which in my running example here is going to be the health department. And the principal wants an agent to complete a task. So the agent here is going to be the hospital. And two important characteristics or properties of this principal agent model that I'm going to bring in today's analysis, and just these are just generally like cool properties of this framework, is that we're going to be able to account for decentralized information, where here the agent is going to be the expert in their own treatments. The agent is going to know more about the task they're completing and their own effort than the principal. So here in our case, we're going to have that the agent actually, they're the ones who know about their own treatment effect. The principal's not going to know this. In the principal agent model, you also have decentralized interests, where here, like the principal we're going to assume is someone who is aligned with trying to achieve broader social welfare, but the agent is going to be responding to whatever quality metric the principal sets. So in this case, we're going to have a setting where the principal sets the contract that determines the agent's reward. And given these two properties, now a couple of broad strokes questions that you can ask about this framework and this model is, well, what rewards should the principal set to achieve their social goals, and what are the agent's optimal actions that are going to be in response to this environment? Okay, so now that I've set up well, actually, any questions about the notation or this background? Yeah.
Yeah, what is knowing more about so can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
So knowing more about the task and effort, can you put that again? Like the hospital knows more about what?
Great. Actually, I'm about to go through that in detail. So perfect. Great question. That's a good segue. So yes, what exactly is the information structure that we're working with? Okay. So I'm going to assume here. So in our constructed setting, I'm going to assume that the principal observes for n different patients their covariates X. So this is like age or demographic information, prior medical history. The principal is also going to observe what treatments were assigned to those patients. So that's the variable T. And the principal will observe the outcomes that happens after those treatments are assigned. And specifically, we're going to assume that the principal only observes outcomes for treated patients. So this Y variable is potentially missing if the patient was untreated. And given these observables, the principal gets to choose a reward function W, which is a function of Y, T, and X. But get to your point on, okay, so now what does the agent observe? What additional information does the agent have? So I'm assuming here that the agent observes the patient's covariates X, and the agent is going to know their own treatment effects. So they're going to know the conditional potential outcomes conditioned on patient covariates X. That's their own mu0 and mu1 of X. So I'm assuming the principal doesn't know this, but the agent actually knows how good they are at treating patients. And knowing this information, the agent is going to get to respond to that reward function by picking a treatment rule. And their treatment rule here is, I'm assuming to be probabilistic, their stochastic treatment rule, where pi of X represents the probability that the hospital will treat conditioned on patient having covariates X. And this, for today's analysis, I'm going to have a stochastic treatment rule. In general, like this would go through with a deterministic one as well. Okay, so given that this is the information structure we have, here's how our game will proceed. So the game between the principal and agent is going to be a sequential one, like a Stackelberg game, where first the principal or the health department is going to get to choose the reward function, so they move first. And in response, the agent or hospital is going to best respond with their treatment rule pi W. And I'm going to assume here that pi W is a best response specifically to just this reward function W, so it's maximizing the expectation of W. And let me just quickly note here that this is a pretty limited setup in the sense that I'm only specifically looking at the effect of the quality metric alone on the treatment policy. More generally, we should be bringing in, we can bring in things like cost and competition and potentially even truthfulness later. But for now, we're just looking at what is the effect of the quality metric alone on the treatment policy in terms of this best response. Yes.
Does that include the agent's knowledge of mu?
Yes, exactly. Yes, right. So the agent knows that when they're first. Thank you.
So the output is the policy or the actions on each of the agents, each of the patients. So you can say, I'm going to treat these patients, or you could actually get out. This seems to say, I'm going to tell you that my policy.
The output is a treatment policy. So the output is the hospital's choice of whom to treat. Wait, sorry, what do you mean by the?
Well, one I could just say, I'm going to treat these people. The hospital could just output that. The other one they could output their policy, say, here is my rules I'm going to do.
You mean the principal could output a policy that they?
Well, no, the agent.
Yeah.
You said the agent says their policy.
Yeah.
Presumably that's for any of these things. What am I going to do? As opposed to keeping that more secret, or not, and then just saying I'm going to treat these people.
That's a good point, right? So actually, from the principal's standpoint, they don't actually really care what specific policy. Okay, they don't care to know pi specifically. All they want is a guarantee that whatever pi gets implemented maximizes social welfare. So the output here, I think, is the first of what you said, of the output is the actual treatment outcomes that.
Because they only treat patients 3, 5, and 17.
Right, and then the principal is then going to observe okay, 3, 5, and 17 got treated, and the principal observe their outcomes. Right, so it's not just the agent handing the principal here's what I'm going to do. It's we're assuming the agent's actually going to do it. And the principal doesn't really need to know the specifics of what pi was.
So it's a not transparent model, right? The action is basically not transparent to the principal. All it knows is that you treated 3, 5, and 7. It doesn't know why.
Right. Yeah. Or the principal doesn't need to. Yeah.
Maybe beating the horse here, but just to be clear, I think the question is about whether the principal sees the policy or only samples from the policy. Does the principal have to estimate what the policy was, for example?
Oh, you mean when computing their,
Well, I mean, you're drawing it kind of as though the principal sees this object pi, right, which would seem to say that they don't have a kind of sampling problem of trying to estimate what these probabilities were.
oh, that's a good point, yes. Okay, so in this case, like, I think my short answer is that, like, I think that's actually not going to matter for the purposes of, like, okay, let's see. The principal wants to design a reward that maximizes an expected social welfare. So in that sense, like, all we are gonna look at is like, what theoretical guarantee do we have about what that expectation is gonna be? In that sense, I'm not assuming that the principal doesn't need to actually observe this function pi to get that. All they need is to observe the samples of what happens. So
It might be true about your result, but it isn't necessarily true in the model, right? Like at this point, right? We don't necessarily know that it would only be the expectation of that, because you could have a reward structure that said if it's more than exactly 11%, then you get a reward, and otherwise you don't, and only treat 8 people. So there's going to be variance around whether you're above or below 11%. You might care about gaining that threshold.
yes. Okay. Yeah, I think that okay, so yeah, I think to answer that question, the principal does, oh, interesting. Great, okay, right, so maybe let me go back to like this, in this case, like, we're not actually assuming that the principal observes the pi directly. The principal is only gonna observe like the realized covariance treatments and outcomes. So yeah. I think that, oh, and then what was the Zoom question from?
Yeah, shouldn't we think that hospitals know X while health department only observes X partially? That seems like an important part of the story. For example, by talking to a patient, doctors may learn more about their habits, which allow me to better predict treatment effects, while principal may not observe that.
That is an excellent question, and that's actually exactly what I'm going to get to in the third part of this talk. So yes, that's super important, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that soon. But for now, I'm actually, yeah, so in this like first part though, for now, I'm assuming that we have a symmetry of information. And then I'm gonna show what happens when we have that asymmetry. Great, excellent questions. Okay, so now let me get into what actually the goals are of the principal here in this model. So the principal's goal here is to design the reward function W that maximizes a concept of welfare effect, which comes from policy learning and policy evaluation. And welfare effect is basically capturing what is my expectation of my outcomes under the treatment rule minus the outcomes if no one were to get treated. So one way to think of this is like basically how much is this hospital's treatment rule and this hospital's treatments adding to society. And the principal's goal is going to be they want to pick their reward function that maximizes this. So I'm going to define a notion of regret here, which is going to be the welfare effect of the best possible treatment policy for that hospital, minus the welfare effect of the policy that got optimized or got induced by my reward function W. So this regret notion is going to be something like this function is something the principal wants to get as small as possible, and they want to pick a W that makes this as small as possible. Okay, so, oh yeah.
Is that just the same, saying they just want to maximize welfare?
It's exactly the same, yeah. I'm just giving right, it's just the negative. Yeah. But one thing I am doing is like, I guess with regret, we're comparing welfare relative to the best possible.
Because it changes the units, but it has the same maximum, right?
Yes, right. But it's in like the theorems I'm gonna refer to regret. Okay, so now I think this, I'm gonna go through an example now of how we can use this framework to analyze the incentive problems that show up with this status quo quality metric, which is the mortality rate. And maybe this will help make some of the properties of this model more clear. So here, we're analyzing this mortality rate metric, which more generally I'm going to refer to as an average treated outcome, because what we're doing is, in this metric is taking an average of the outcome over treated patients. So that's this Y times the treatment indicator T, and I'm dividing by everyone who was treated. So in our framework, what we find is that the agent's best response now to this treatment this reward function W, is to treat only the patients with the highest expected treated outcome. And this tracks with the findings by Chernow et al. That, I mean, this is a very just simple response that tracks with Chernow et al.'s findings that like the treatments tended towards healthier patients after the mortality rate metric was put out there. And the regret, as we just defined here, is going to be unbounded. So now what I'll show is two simple modifications that we can make to this status quo mortality rate metric that's going to reduce this regret. And the first change that we're going to need to make is to reward the benefit from treatment rather than just looking at the outcomes themselves. So all I'm doing here is I'm subtracting in the numerator this function mu hat 0 of x, which is a function that's trying to estimate the untreated counterfactual for a patient characteristics x. So this is kind of a learning component that we pull out here, where if this is, ideally, this mu hat 0 of x is approximating the untreated potential outcome. So for healthier patients, this mu hat 0 of x we would hope to be potentially higher, so such that the difference is going to be a little bit smaller. And for sicker patients for whom the benefit to treatment would potentially be higher, then mu hat 0 we would also expect to be lower to capture this bigger difference. And I call this the ATT because this is in expectation. This matches the causal quantity of the average treatment effect treated. So actually a question that I'll throw out to the audience now is, this is going to help with regret, like by putting this in the numerator, but we're actually not yet going to get to zero regret. There's still a problem with setting the ATT as the reward function here. Does anyone have any ideas as to why that might happen?
You also have to worry about the people who would be die even if they were treated or not. So you have to worry about that.
I think what you're, that's a good point. I think that's not, okay, yeah, that's a good point. I think
There should be something in the denominator for the patients who weren't treated and didn't die. Right?
Yes, okay, okay, I think I don't fully understand both of those, but I think that's probably my feeling right now. I think you guys both know what's going on there. I'll talk to you after. But what I'm hearing is that there's a problem with the denominator. Oh, actually, Kevin, yeah.
Is it the case that this is only going to lead you to treat the people that you help the most rather than everybody?
Yes, and I think that's a phrasing that I think made sense to me. I'm sorry, that's on me. But yes, right. So in having this denominator here, where I'm dividing by all the patients who were treated, the best response of the agent is going to be to treat only the patients with the highest expected treatment effect. So this is a little bit better than before, rather than just looking at the highest treated outcome. And what we're going to get here is that regret is bounded. So at least we can do a little bit better, but it's still not zero. And so the second change that we're going to need to make is to remove this denominator. So now we're going to reward a total effect instead of an average effect. And intuitively what this is doing, maybe rephrasing what was said a little bit, is intuitively what this is doing is rewarding more treatments. So if the hospital treats more people and those end up having positive effects, we get more reward. And the best response here is now going to be the optimal thing in the unconstrained setting, which is to treat all patients with positive treatment effect. And the regret here is going to be zero as long as my estimate of the untreated potential outcome, mu hat 0, is a good estimate. I need it to be unbiased. So kind of summarizing what we've got, oh yeah, sorry, yes.
Does this have an effect of like a kind of assumption that all treatments are identical because if you treat more, probably you treat less well or something?
Yes, so I am assuming that treatments are identical in that sense. Not necessarily identical conditioned on a patient's characteristics, but right, but treating more will not reduce. Yeah. Yes.
This leads me to wonder whether this average treatment effect thing was a straw man. Like, is it really the case that a hospital can maximize its total reward by treating one person?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some sense, it depends on what like metric you use here, and I think there's also more complicated things that come into this dynamic in reality. So
In some sense, they get paid for each person they treat, but there must be some sense in which it's a total effect rather than an average effect.
yeah, and I think like when we bring this into real health context, it does get more complicated like that, right? Like this is what we've looked at here is like, okay, in a very like toy vacuum sense, what is specifically only the effect of the quality metric on like what incentives does the quality metric push the agent towards? But in reality, yeah, like if you have an actual hospital that's operating, they're not only trying to, optimize the single quality metric by themselves. They also have their own costs to account for. They do in some sense get like, I mean, they do literally get more payment for more treatments than they do via other means other than like quality metric.
Okay, so I think what I hear you saying is that there's, the real payment they get is a sort of payment per patient that looks sort of like this, and then sort of a bonus that comes from the quality metric that's based on the average. So they're not kind of quite at this optimum because the average is part of it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good realistic summary of like what's closer to reality that's happening. Yeah. Oh yes.
I'm a little unclear about the information structure here, because with that treatment assignment rule, how does the principal know MUPAT 0? How does it estimate it?
Excellent question. That's actually exactly what I'm going to talk about next. Yes, and in fact, we've talked about two simple changes, but simple doesn't always mean easy. And the difficulty here is exactly this difficulty you're pointing out, which is estimating this MUPAT 0. How is the principal actually supposed to know this? So what I will point out about this kind of functional form that we've arrived at here is that we've isolated, okay, here's the piece of information that the principal needs to know. And this reduces to a causal inference problem here on trying to estimate an untreated potential outcome or an average untreated potential outcome. And in general, like doing this kind of causal inference has, there's like, we can talk about now what are the actual mathematical conditions on a data set under which this kind of inference can be done. Generally, it's a very difficult problem and can be difficult depending on, when you can know that assumptions hold. I will say that like, generally it is known what assumptions we'll need in order to do this unbiased estimation. So what I'm going to show in this slide is a couple of example data sets and a couple of example conditions under which you can get this unbiased estimate. But, more generally, I will note this is a very difficult problem. So a first potential data source from which this could come is some maybe auxiliary or historical untreated data. And the condition that we're going to need on that data is a concept of ignorability from causal inference, which essentially says that my treatments and my outcomes are not confounded by any additional variables other than the X that the principal observes. And one thing that our framework kind of helps a little bit with here is that we only need untreated observational data. So that means that for a given hospital, we don't need just that specific hospital's data. We can bring in, say, historical data from clinical trials or from other hospitals, since we don't care about the specific treatments, or we're not trying to estimate the specific hospital's treatment effect. We just want the untreated average potential outcome. But this is still a really challenging problem. And the main challenges that are going to show up here are one central threat here is going to be confounding in that data set. And that gets talked about a lot in the causal inference literature. Another challenge here is going to be the possibility of distribution shift, where maybe historical data from other hospitals or clinical trials might have data collected in slightly different ways. The ways in which treatments or diagnoses were made might have been different. The measurements themselves might be different. So yes, this is going to be challenging. But also like in kind of framing this, maybe this is a launching point for there's been a lot of work in the machine learning literature on how to handle things like distribution shift and even robust optimization for handling some different forms of confounding. So in kind of outlining these things, this is a potential place for statisticians and machine learning folks to maybe come in and help with this problem a bit. Yes?
It's for a random comment, but I feel it ties back to the earlier question. Like if your agent has to disclose its policy and it's a stochastic policy, compared to its actions, then this becomes much easier, right? Because you have ignorability by construction, as long as the agent doesn't put probabilities of 0 or 1, and the policy, it all becomes easier.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying, like, that actually gets at the second data source there, where what if you look at like the agent's untreated units and say that their treatment policy only depends on, say their exact treatment policy and that it only depends on characteristics X. So in that case, so earlier on, when I was like setting up the information asymmetry structure, I assumed that the only data access that I assumed we had was the outcomes for treated individuals. But let's say we did have some of the, we did observe some of the outcomes for untreated individuals. I wasn't assuming that in general, but if we do observe some of that, then in that case, exactly, we can now use that data to say supplement our μ0 estimate, and we can use that specifically when you have this, in our initial kind of toy world where we don't have any information asymmetry, then that can contribute to an unbiased estimator for the untreated potential outcome. So the requirements here is that either we know the agent's treatment policy pi, and we know that it only depends on the characteristics that we observe, that the principal observes X. So our kind of advantage here with that, like the pro of that is that, we won't have any like nasty distribution shift issues. But a challenge here though is still that this can't be used alone to estimate μ0, because there's going to be an issue of the fact that we can't guarantee that for any given patient characteristics X, an agent there will exist any untreated patients there. And that's for both incentive reasons and for missing data reasons. So in causal inference, that's called positivity, and we're not going to be able to guarantee that with the agent's data. So I would say that, like in this case, the second source maybe might serve as a supplement to to maybe some auxiliary data that's still going to be necessary. Yeah.
Is there like a more general incentive problem here though, where the agent could choose who they treat to perturb μ0 and then change their rule?
No, that's great, and we analyze that in the paper actually. So that's exactly what's going to show up when you have this, when you use the agent's data to estimate μ0. And I think that's actually, I found that to be a super interesting thing to analyze. And I think and we give the requirements under which, like what's kind of, okay, what I think is really cool about that particular problem is that when we do have this first requirement that their treatment policy only depended on X, and this wasn't the only data set that we used, so we're relying on this positivity assumption, then actually the agent can't game it in principle. But once we have this more realistic world where we have information asymmetry, then it does become gameable, and I'm going to bound to regret. Yes.
You say you only need μ0 to be an unbiased estimator. So why is that enough? Is there no way for the agent to exploit variance in the estimate?
Excellent question. Good. So the fact that we only need the μ0 to be an unbiased estimator here relies on the fact that I'm assuming a form of risk neutrality in the agent. So my agent right now is only best responding to the expectation of the reward function W. More generally, when we bring in other external factors or potential risk aversion of the agent, then we are going to care about the variance of μ0. But in this case, if I'm assuming just a best response to the expectation of the quality metric, then we only need unbiased. But
so μ0 is unknown to the agent, and so they have to take an expectation over it too.
μ0 is it's inherently a stochastic. It is a stochastic quantity in that it's a sample measure. Yeah. Very good questions. Amazing. Okay, so and then let me end this slide with just a note on a central threat here is going to be confounding, and this is something that's discussed a lot in the causal inference literature. And there are some cases when sometimes it's hard to verify if this is true. There's some cases when you do have it maybe or when you do have unconfoundedness, say through randomized control trials and things like that. But that is still going to be a central threat. Okay, so summarizing a bit from what we've just talked about in this section, the key result here is that we've formulated this, we've given this form for a total treatment effect reward function and split out a little bit what data sources could be used towards computing this. So this overall reward function or quality metric is based on the agent's treated data, which we assume we have access to. And then we've pulled out this sort of modular learning component, which now we have a requirement that it's unbiased, and This can be, say, learned from, as we just talked about, potentially some combination of historical data and agent untreated data. And we've given some conditions under which that could produce net biases. So now I'm going to shift a little bit towards talking about what happens when these quality metrics plug into these online ranking systems, which are really well studied in machine learning. And I'm going to ask, do rankings that are based on these quality metrics continue to behave reasonably? So these rankings include things like US News and World Report or Cal Hospital Compare or these other organizations like Leapfrog or things like that that ingest these CMS metrics and turn them into hospital rankings that they then publish or scores into these subjects. And this is an important question because these like large online ranking platforms reach a lot of people, and also they kind of treat themselves as ratings that you can trust when picking which hospitals to go to. So it is important that if we were to modify these quality metrics, or even as the existing quality metrics stand, that they, when ingested, still are going to lead to reasonable behavior. So the particular question that I'm going to address today, as far as understanding whether these rankings are going to behave reasonably, is just I'm going to talk about a very basic ranking desiderata here, which is just that when a quality metric is used for ranking, that it's going to rank better hospitals higher. Just super basic here. We can get more complicated, but I'm just starting with this. And what I'm going to ask in this section is if we apply the same quality metric from the first part, that even if we have all the perfect estimators that we need there, is that going to satisfy these ranking desiderata? So formalizing a couple of definitions of what it looks like for better hospitals to be ranked higher. I'm going to give a first definition here, which I'll call uniform rank preservation, which says that if hospital 1 is uniformly better than hospital 2 for all different patient characteristics X, then my reward function, my quality metric should be higher for hospital 1 than for hospital 2. This is assuming I'm doing a ranking based on that metric. So here in this plot, I'm showing for all the different patient characteristics X, the conditional average treatment effect condition on those characteristics is higher for hospital 1 than hospital 2. But that's a pretty strict definition. I'm requiring full uniform betterness for hospital 1 and hospital 2. So I'm going to relax this here in the second definition to relative rank preservation, where if hospital 1 is better than hospital 2 on average for some reference population, then the quality metric should be higher for hospital 1 than hospital 2. And so here, maybe hospital 1 is better for some subset of the population than hospital 2 is, but maybe uniformly on average over the patient characteristics X, then hospital 1 comes out better. Yes.
Can you go to the previous slide?
Yeah, of course.
Maybe I'm just missing something obvious here. We get to hear you say something, but doesn't it matter what the hospital does? Like the hospital could be better for every patient, but it could have a policy that is treating people less well.
That's a great question. Yeah, and so actually what I'm assuming here is that the policy that gets, I'm assuming that, or we're going to talk about this, but I'm assuming the policy, I'm thinking about the policy that gets induced by the quality metric concurrently with this ranking desiderata. So this is this is something that we're gonna want to see in addition to the agent picking the optimal treatment policy. So when I do assume that the agent picks the optimal treatment policy, then they will also have better, they'll also end up having a better impact on social welfare.
So I should think of this as being under the optimal policy, or for every policy they can each choose, but they both have to choose the same one? Or?
I think of this as being under the optimal policy. We're ideal. This is we're thinking kind of an ideal sense of the optimal.
Is it the optimal policy for the reference population or for the population that
Good. Yes. So the optimal policy for in the assumptions that we've made here on the agent not having cost issues and budget constraint issues, so the agent can treat everyone, the optimal policy is going to be the same under any different kind of reference population as under the
because you can treat infinity.
That's right. Yes, but when you do bring in cost and budget constraints, that's going to change. Great question.
The big assumption here is that they are not able to manipulate the principal's calculation of the conditional average treatment effect. That's the central assumption.
That's the central assumption. Great. And I'll show a little bit how these relate as well, which is kind of the key point of this whole section. So let's bring this back to that quality metric from the first part of the talk. So the first question I'm going to ask here is, if I were to just bring in this quality metric out of the box, which we said, assuming all of our like nice toy assumptions from the beginning that we have an unbiased p hat 0 and all of that. If I plug this into a ranking system and use this to rank hospitals, is that going to satisfy my ranking desiderata? So I'll throw it out a bit to the audience now of, okay, well, maybe I'll show a little preview. The answer is no. Okay, so does anyone have any ideas for why this thing out of the box can't just be used to rank hospitals? Yes?
So the actual number now depends on the distribution you get, right? Not the policy, but the W.
Exactly, yes, and that is the first problem here, is that like, yeah, great. So because here we're like rewarded, this, as it stands here, a larger hospital is going to have an advantage in this quality metric compared to a smaller one. So, great. There's one more issue here. The second one's a little bit trickier, so I'm.
Does it also depend not only on how many patients you get, but how sick those patients are?
Excellent. Yes.
Right?
Great question. Yes, exactly. Right. There's this issue that like different hospitals are going to serve different populations, right? Some hospitals might serve a more elderly population. Others might serve, say, maybe more low-income populations. So the issue is that this is also going to, as Margot says, give an advantage to a hospital that receives an easier population. So to address both of these problems, we now need to modify this quality metric. Oh, yes.
The ranking itself also maybe return input, like higher ranked hospitals probably also get a different population of patients.
Great, yes, bringing in all the different incentives. That's a great point. That's not something that I'm addressing here because that's like a maybe more, we have to consider more time steps now on like maybe in the next time step. But if you want to talk more about exploring that problem, I would love to, because yes, that's totally something that can happen. Great, okay, so the solution to these two particular ranking issues here is to give a reweighting term. So I'm just going to reweight that first quality metric from the first part of the talk. All I'm doing is tacking on this term in parentheses here, which is a reweighting term. And there's two components to this. The first is this 1 over n, the number of, I'm just normalizing by the number of patients that the hospital, that come to the hospital's door. And I'm assuming here that this is something that the hospital doesn't have control over, but as Taylor pointed out, like we might not always, there could be either sequential effects or, maybe some world where there will be potential incentive effects here. But for now, I'm assuming this is a constant thing that the hospital can control. Okay, so in addition to this normalization term, I also need a likelihood ratio. And this likelihood ratio is, in the numerator, I have the density for some reference population X naught that I want to normalize to. And in the denominator, it's the density for the hospital's population that comes in. And this also relates to, it's like I'm essentially just doing importance weighting here. And I'm now adjusting this metric to that reference population. So theoretically now with this reweighting term, we get that now we can have our ranking desiderata be satisfied. So now hospitals will be ranked higher if they are either uniformly better at treating all patients or better on average, let's say, for some reference population X naught. But this is also, so this is nice that we now have these nice ranking desiderata, but what about all of those incentive properties that we talked about in the first part of this talk? Can we, by tacking on this reweighting term, do we still get that the treatment incentives in our world are going to be aligned with social welfare? So the second main result here is that this reweighting term still preserves our incentive alignment properties. And that's the important thing that connects both incentives to these ranking systems that ingest these things. And in fact, not just that ranking term, that reweighting term isn't the only thing we can put here, but what we show theoretically is that actually any positive function can be substituted in here as a function of X to reweight this measure and still preserve incentive alignment. So what this means is that now we have a functional form or a function class, which a ranking system designer can now choose from and either potentially even optimize for whatever policy desiderata they have. And this functional form now effectively decouples our ranking desiderata that we were talking about from the incentive alignment issues.
It's really important here that there's no cost, right? Like the fact that any positive function works here is just because you get a positive return for everyone you treat, as long as you should have treated them, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So if there's other externalities here, this would change a lot.
Right, I think it would, yes, that would certainly limit the, we would now need to like rein in this function class and account for that, yeah. I think you'd have to account for the specific cost structure.
Yeah.
Is this result only because that function is constant with respect to the choices the agent makes, or is it something more subtle?
You mean the function G is
Yeah.
constant with the choices? Yes, yes, that is exactly it. Actually, yeah. The function needs to be, you can include the treatment policy pi in that function.
So just when the agent is thinking about their strategic choices, they get scaled, they may or may not like any scale, but they can control the scale.
That's right. And if that scale, the other like kind of, you know, may or may not be subtle part of this is that the scaling has to be positive. I can't penalize, I can't add penalties here. Yeah. But great points. Excellent. Okay, so right. So now let me talk about a couple of, right, so in this kind of decoupling now with this function class, let me talk about some potential policy desiderata that a ranking system designer might run into. So the first design choice that they're going to need to make is in selecting, you know, potentially what reference population they're going to normalize to. And one potential maybe default choice here is to consider a general user population. So for something like Cal Hospital Compare, perhaps this is like a uniform distribution over people in California. But one cool thing that comes from this too is that, oh no. Okay, there's just a little picture there. One cool thing that comes from this decoupling as well is that now we now give a way to personalize these rankings and tailor them to maybe particular subpopulations of age, gender, income, etc., in a way that doesn't harm the incentive alignment properties under the assumptions that we've made. So this helps for, you know, in machine learning, there's a lot of talk about how to do things in a personalized way. And here we're kind of showing, okay, you can personalize things if you do them in this specific way. And then, you know, now you can do this and also account for those broader economic incentive issues simultaneously.
You can't personalize the rewards, you're talking about personalizing the ranking. So you're saying,
yes,
for your demographic characteristics, here's the ranking on hospitals that you should choose.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's right. So it'd be like showing personalized rankings to different groups. Great. Okay. A second possible design choice that I'll also mention here is, you know, maybe with this G function, and maybe the policy designer might, or policymaker might want to say give a boost to like a public versus private institution, maybe accounting for their resourcing or cost structures and things like that. But you know, that's a more broader, more general problem that yes, we can also talk more about. Okay, so summarizing now what we've talked about with rankings, are the key result from this section is I've now taken this function class that I presented in the first part and made it a bit more general. And I've shown that here's now a function class that in under our assumptions, we can both reward and rank based on this. And what we've pulled out here, well, is in the first part, you know, here's our modular learning component, this unbiased, untreated potential outcome. And then now with ranking, we've shown that, okay, we've tacked on this positive function g of x that now a ranking system designer can choose. So now I'm going to come back around to, oh, yes.
So just as a time check, it's 11:30, we've asked you a million questions. Do you think you can wrap up in 10 minutes?
Absolutely, yeah, easy, for sure. Okay, and I'm going to come around, and in the last, I guess, 10 minutes or so, wait, do we have a hard stop at 11:30 or?
No, I just think people might have an expectation of a 1 hour talk. They can sort of keep having questions and chatting after that.
Great, for sure. I think the rest of this will be less than this, probably about 5 minutes. Great, okay, so in the last part, I'm going to now discuss this extremely huge problem of information asymmetry, kind of the elephant in the room here, which is what if hospitals know more about patients than the agencies, than the regulatory agencies. And Drown I'll even point to this when they say providers may be able to improve their rankings by selecting patients on the basis of characteristics that are unobservable to the analysts and predictive of good outcomes. So Victor pointed this out earlier. So now that in this information asymmetry world, we're gonna have to change the setup a bit. And here's how we're gonna do that. So our principal is gonna have the same information structure. They're gonna observe the same covariance X, treatments D, outcomes Y, and they're gonna pick the same reward function accordingly. But our agent is gonna know more now. So our agent is gonna observe the covariance X, but also some additional covariance U for each patient. And the agent is still gonna know their exact treatment effects. So they're gonna know the expected average conditional potential outcomes, the expected potential outcomes conditioned on both X and U. And knowing this, now the agent is going to get to also choose their treatment rule that depends on both X and U. So in the setup now, with the agent knowing more information, I'm now going to talk about the consequences of that on our metric that we showed at the very beginning on this is like total treatment effect reward function. So there's going to be two effects on this. And the first effect that this is going to induce is the potential for confounding bias in my estimate, my untreated potential outcome mu hat 0. What I'll say about this is that when you have information asymmetry, it becomes possibly more likely that we'll see confounding bias in whatever maybe observational auxiliary data that shows up, if that auxiliary data is maybe coming from some other hospital or something. On the other hand, we might not necessarily have confounding bias in the sense that like auxiliary data might come from some data set where like there isn't this information asymmetry, or the data might come from a clinical trial or an RCT that doesn't have confounding issues. So this is something that isn't necessarily guaranteed to be a problem here, but maybe is more likely to be a problem. But the really interesting part, I think our interesting result here is that it's not just about confounding bias. That's not the only problem that occurs. And the other problem that we're gonna have to contend with now is a problem of unmeasured heterogeneity. So we're only even if we have like a perfect unbiased estimate of the untreated potential outcome condition on X, we're only measuring mu0 of X, but the agent gets to choose their policy based on X and U. So that's not, this is like even when I can do causal inference, I still have this problem from information asymmetry. And so our key result here is that when there is information asymmetry, unconfoundedness is not enough to align to like guarantee no regret. There's still going to be a regret even if my mu hat 0 estimate is unbiased. So what I'll show now is some theoretical results on under what conditions can we give a bound on regret under information asymmetry, and what can we learn from that. So specifically, my regret is going to be very closely tied to this notion of unmeasured heterogeneity. And so I'm going to make an assumption here that we have bounded unmeasured heterogeneity, which is the effect of U on the untreated potential outcome given X. And so what this quantity here is, we think of this as a statistical error between my mu0 of X as kind of a marginal quantity, and my mu0 of X and U, which is maybe a more conditional quantity. Okay, so gamma marg here is representing the upper bound on this amount of, I'm gonna let that be like this quantity, which I'll term here unmeasured heterogeneity. So under this, the regret is very closely tied to this quantity. So we show that the regret under my total treatment reward function is going to be upper bounded by a linear function of this degree of unmeasured heterogeneity. And we actually also show a matching lower bound here, which is just gamma marg alone. So actually like regret is directly in this sort of linear relationship with this specific value of unmeasured heterogeneity. So the kind of policy significance of this is now here's a quantity that maybe if you as maybe a principal might not know exactly what, like, okay, if the principal has some sense of what this gamma marg might be, then they'll have maybe some anticipation of what regret might be. It also gives an opportunity for a principal to say, like, if they have to choose what features that they're going to use, they can try to minimize this particular amount, this particular quantity. And in the medical literature, for instance, like sometimes there is a sense of what this gamma might be. For instance, let's say the outcome that we're interested in is something like a cardiovascular risk. then it's like some of the medical literature says that if somebody's already a smoker, then whether or not they drink doesn't really make that much of a difference in their cardiovascular risk. So in this case, if the principal observes X as whether or not somebody smokes, then an agent additionally observes whether they drink doesn't really change things very much here. So in this case, like the regret might still be low. On the other hand, it's also known that some characteristics might compound on each other. So for instance, with cardiovascular risks, someone's sex hormones and whether they have diabetes are compounding factors. So this is kind of saying like, okay, regret is very closely related to this notion of unmeasured heterogeneity, and it now gives an opportunity for machine learning folks and statisticians to also think about this quantity and say, okay, if say a policymaker is selecting which features X that they're going to use, then this might give some direction towards that. Also, more generally, in the paper, we show that there's effects of potential amplification of regret if you pick the wrong X's. This relates to bias amplification issues in causal inference, which I might be saying this too fast, but I'm totally happy to discuss later with folks who are familiar with that literature. Okay, now I'm gonna, in the interest of time, just come back around and summarize everything we talked about today. So first we talked about this incentive problem. How do we design quality metrics that lead to better hospital incentives? And I gave kind of a very in a vacuum type of model that led to this result that we can reward a total treatment effect by estimating the untreated counterfactual. And this is kind of a point now where machine learning and stats folks can come in and also improve things. Second, we talked about this problem of online ranking platforms, which is well studied in the machine learning literature. And we showed that actually just plugging those quality metrics in directly doesn't lead to reasonable behavior necessarily, but we do show that a certain type of reweighting is not going to mess with the incentive alignment from the first part and can also be used to make rankings behave reasonably and potentially even personalize things. And then third, we just discussed this, how the problem of information asymmetry comes in and screws things up. And regret exists even without confounding from the first part, so you can get your perfect estimate, but there's other sources that lead to regret. And success here is going to depend on this degree of unmeasured heterogeneity. And this issue of unmeasured heterogeneity leads to several, I'm going to talk a bit about like some potential open questions in this world of information asymmetry. So the first is with this, now that we've kind of isolated this gamma marge for this unmeasured heterogeneity term, one thing I've been thinking about is, can we bring in machine learning techniques like robust policy learning to mitigate this problem of information asymmetry, potentially reduce regret, knowing what the gamma marge might be? A second question I've been really interested in is a more mechanism design or economic type of question, which is, can we think a bit about the incentives for information and sharing in these systems? And this goes beyond just the particular treatment selection problem that we've talked about today, but more generally, when you have some metric that's gets set, who has information on how to improve that metric and when would they share it? And I've been working with some economists on this question. And finally, of course, there's tons of extensions to our model today, many of which came up in questions throughout the talk, and I would be totally happy to discuss more of these and how we can extend this later, including things like cost of treatment, bringing in potential proxies for health risk, like cost, what happens then, incentives for improvement is an interesting question. You know, what do we do in environments with multiple competing ranking systems and multiple metrics? Lots of opportunity for future work here. And now I'll give a quick note on how this fits into my broader research agenda, which is I've been thinking a lot about bridging gaps between metrics and goals to improve the societal impacts of machine learning. And one other thing that we haven't talked about yet today so much is a problem of implementation gaps, where even after we've defined some metric that we want some machine learning system to satisfy, oh no. Yeah, great. There's still an issue that like we actually still need to be able to incorporate that metric into these machine learning systems, given our data or our modern kind of training protocols. And so I've done a lot of work here on how we can how we can enforce things like fairness when you have noisy data, or these kinds of large scale modern machine learning pipelines that have things like distillation or pre-training and fine-tuning with these LLMs and whatnot. So, and then today's talk has mostly been about, in this vein of thinking about these contextual gaps, where what happens when a machine learning model plugs into a broader social system where you have incentives, you have interactions, And here, I've done some qualitative work on looking at like predictions and interventions of machine learning in education settings. And I think this is kind of where a lot of I see a really interesting place for crossover between economics and machine learning to really come in and think about these, like help machine learning folks think about the societal impacts. One more very cool broad question that I've been excited about is thinking about how asymmetries in power and information and values shape development of machine learning and AI and vice versa. And one last thing I'll say is like I've been pushing on all of these questions of gaps between metrics and goals because behind every machine learning algorithm that gets developed is a metric. And while we've spent so much time developing these optimization techniques, an optimization algorithm is only as good as the metric that it optimizes. So I think anything that we can do towards understanding the incentives and the interdependence in the environment these systems fit into is a step towards getting to better societal impacts of our machine learning systems. Thank you so much, and I would love to take more questions.